Welcome to the Deep Dive, the place where we take the most complex sources and distill them into the knowledge you need fast. Today, we are tackling what is, well, it's perhaps the most fundamental and provocative question of human existence. Why do we feel like we are in control?
It's a beautifully simple question, isn't it? But the answers are just impossibly complex. The concept we're really zeroing in on today is the feeling of conscious will.
Right, that feeling that I am the one making this happen.
Exactly. And our sources are suggesting something really radical. That this feeling that we author our own actions might be an essential adaptive biological mechanism, even if that control is, at the end of the day, an illusion dictated by physics and chemistry.
The idea that our most profound sense of self, our conscious will, is basically an evolutionary feature designed to keep us going, to keep us persistent and adaptive, whether it's real or not, that's just stunning.
It is. So our mission in this deep dive is to try and synthesize some very different fields. We're talking high-level philosophy, the latest neuroscience, and evolutionary psychology to understand exactly why we evolved to feel like the authors of our own destiny.
And you've brought us sources that really cover the whole spectrum. We've got the hardest forms of determinism, we've got explorations into the neurobiology of the sense of agency, and then we dig into the deep evolutionary utility of, well, believing we choose.
We're going to trace the connection between your brain's internal prediction models all the way up to our societal structures of morality and justice. It's a huge topic.
And that's the thing. This debate has monumental real-world consequences, which we can't just ignore. We'll be looking at the core arguments for hard determinism, specifically from the neuroscientist Robert Sapolsky. We'll dissect this psychological phenomenon called the illusion of control, map the specific neural mechanics that generate this feeling of agency, and then finally we have to grapple with the immense fallout.
Things like criminal justice reform, how we think about poverty, the justification of socioeconomic inequality. It all hinges on where you land in this debate.
Okay, let's unpack this, starting with the philosophical battlefield that really frames the whole conversation.
Right. So when you look at centuries of discussion around this, around agency, the positions on how free will and determinism coexist, or more importantly, don't coexist, they really crystallize into three major groups.
And maybe we should quickly define determinism, just so we're all on the same page.
Good idea. Determinism is basically the position that all current events are necessitated by prior events. The universe is like a giant machine operating according to the laws of cause and effect. One thing leads to the next, inevitably.
Okay, so what are the three camps that have formed around that idea?
Well, the first is probably the most intuitive, but it's also the one that's arguably the least scientifically grounded. It's called metaphysical libertarianism.
And that's the belief in, what, actual free choice?
Yes. Genuine, actual free choice. It's the belief that you truly could have chosen otherwise in any given moment, completely independent of that whole seamless causal chain that came before the choice.
But the sources you brought, they point out that mainstream science and a lot of analytical philosophy tend to dismiss this position. Why is that?
Because for it to be true, you need something non-physical to intervene in the physical world. A soul, a spirit, some kind of ghost in the machine that stands outside the laws of physics, just initiate a choice out of nothing.
And if the universe is purely physical and deterministic, that's just illogical.
It's illogical. So increasingly, it's seen as a pure faith position that doesn't really hold up under empirical scrutiny.
Okay, so that leads us to the second, maybe more pragmatic camp. Compatibilism. These thinkers try to bridge the gap. They argue free will is somehow compatible with a fully deterministic universe. This is the one that always makes my head hurt.
Well, it's because it relies on what the sources describe as a sort of linguistic trick. Compatibilists will acknowledge that free choice, the freedom to have willed otherwise, doesn't exist. They get that all actions are caused.
So what do?
They redefine the term free will itself to mean something other than freedom of choice.
So they might say free will is just acting according to your desires, even if the desires themselves were completely determined by your past.
Exactly that. Or they'll define it as just not having a gun to your head, lacking external coercion. It allows them to say free will exists and that it's a socially useful concept, even while they might privately concede that genuine, uncaused free choice is off the table.
It sounds like they're trying to suppress the core incompatibility to keep the language of responsibility alive.
That's one way to put it. It's a kind of philosophical negotiation, really, aimed at maintaining social order.
Which brings us to the third, and I think the most radical position, illusionism.
Yes, the illusionists. They just dispense with all the trickery. They fully embrace the idea that free will, as we all commonly understand it, simply does not exist. For them, determinism wins, period.
But the interesting thing is what they decide to do with that knowledge, right? They're split into two strategies.
Right, you have negative illusionism, where the theorist knows the truth but deliberately stays silent about it in public. They're worried about how society might react.
The other.
Positive illusionism. This goes even further. These theorists might actually engage in overt deception, actively misleading the public about the non-existence of free will, because they believe it's for our own good, for some purported pro-social benefit.
Wow. So they genuinely fear that if we all truly believed we were just biological machines, everything from morality to law would just collapse.
That's the fear. And it's a staggering implication, isn't it? That some leading thinkers believe the integrity of our society turns on actively suppressing the truth of determinism. It just shows you how high the stakes are when we move from theory to reality.
Okay, so if we accept that premise of hard determinism, like these illusionists secretly do, we really have to look at just how powerful that determinism truly is.
And the chief advocate for this seamless view of determinism is the neuroscientist Robert Sapolsky.
Right. His perspective argues that every single human action, every decision, every flicker of intention is fully determined. That we are nothing more than the sum total of our biology and our environment, over which we had absolutely no control.
The power of his argument is really in its holistic approach. It's not just about your genes or just about your environment. It's about what he calls the seamless continuum of influences that stretch all the way back through time.
He's so meticulous about it.
He is. He details how every single factor, from evolution shaping our species to the specific genes you inherit, to the epigenetics that were altered by your early environment, to the hormones that were circulating in your blood minutes before an event, and even the local contextual cues right at that moment, they all just merge into a single causal current.
So there's literally no crack, no little space, no independent source of action for free will to lodge itself into. It's just a relentless cascade of biology.
It is. It's, as the source material colorfully puts it, biological turtles all the way down.
Mm-hmm.
And that phrase is so crucial because it includes the things we traditionally think of as moral or voluntary.
Like character.
Exactly. Character, resilience, backbone, empathy.
Mm-hmm.
These aren't self-generated virtues in his view. They're outcomes. They're determined by uncontrollable forces just as much as your height or your predisposition to, say, mathematical ability is.
Can you give us a concrete example of how deep these early uncontrollable influences really reach?
Sure. Let's consider the role of the prefrontal cortex, the PFC. This is our brain's command center. It's critical for impulse control, long-term planning, moral character. It's the bit of the brain we credit when someone chooses the right thing over the easy thing.
The seat of willpower, so to speak.
Right. But studies on PFC development show how profoundly determined its quality is. I think you'll recall the source detailing the socioeconomic influence.
Yes, I do. The socioeconomic status of a child's family can actually predict the size and the gray matter content of their PFC.
And this is observable even in 4-week-olds. Toddlers, kindergartners, lower SES consistently predicts worse PFC development. And the mediating factors are entirely outside the child's control. Things like chronic stress and lower levels of stimulation.
So a child growing up in a high-stress, low-stimulation environment is hearing fewer complex sentences, they're bathing in more cortisol, and that environment is literally limiting the neural architecture that will one day be responsible for their adult willpower or self-control.
That is the bitter truth of it. The structural and functional development of the PFC, which will later dictate whether a person can stare down temptation at some critical right-wrong crossroads, is the outcome of influences from the second before, minutes before, millennia before.
You can't just will yourself to have more willpower if the neural infrastructure for that impulse control was compromised by your genetics or your childhood stress.
Exactly. And if character and moral strength are the end product of this long, uncontrollable biological and environmental arc, doesn't that make holding someone accountable for poor decisions, well, fundamentally unjust?
From the hard determinist viewpoint, yes. It makes it scientifically unjustifiable to blame, praise, or reward someone based on their character or their willpower, because those traits are just outcomes.
Their character is a biological manifestation, not an independent choice. Blame only really makes sense if there was a self standing outside that causal stream who could have truly chosen otherwise.
Okay, but the most common counterargument you hear to this seamless chain of determinism is the appeal to physics. People say, what about true randomness? Doesn't quantum mechanics introduce indeterminacy that gives us a crack for free will?
Right, the quantum argument, and that's systematically rejected by most hard determinists for a couple main reasons. First, even the unpredictable stuff we often confuse for freedom doesn't actually fit the bill.
You mean like chaos theory?
Exactly. Sapolsky points out that chaos theory, which describes these complex, sensitive, nonlinear systems, is often called deterministically unpredictable.
Meaning that while a chaotic system like the weather is impossible to predict over time, it's still governed by strict deterministic equations.
Precisely. It allows you to retroactively explain why something happened, but it doesn't give you the power to choose what will happen next. It's determined, just unpredictable.
Okay, but what about the really weird stuff, like quantum entanglement or tunneling? The idea that events at the subatomic level might be truly random.
Well, the consensus among many neuroscientists, and they're citing people like physicist Max Tegmark, is that quantum effects are extremely unlikely to bubble up to the macroscopic level of the brain where they could influence a complex behavior.
Because the brain is just too messy.
It's described as having too much decohering, warm, wet noise. It's just too warm, too wet, and too chaotic for these super delicate, tiny quantum indeterminacies to manifest meaningfully in a thought or a motor action.
But let's play devil's advocate for a second. Let's just imagine that quantum randomness could influence our behavior. Wouldn't that actually be the death knell for the intuitive idea of free will? Because freedom isn't the same as randomness.
That is the absolute critical distinction. If true quantum randomness did influence your decision-making, it would just produce a random, unpredictable output, a twitch, a spasm. And that's fundamentally incompatible with the conscious control and moral accountability we're looking for.
We want to punish or reward someone based on the consistency of their moral character, not based on some random subatomic dice roll that made them jerk their arm one way instead of the other.
Exactly. When you talk about agency, you're interested in consistent, coherent, goal-directed behavior. If your action was caused by randomness, you're not free. You're just random.
So the freedom required for moral responsibility can't logically be based on indeterminacy.
It can't, which means the causal chain remains unbroken, and this feeling of conscious choice remains an anomaly we have to explain.
So, if determinism is scientifically airtight and there is no true freedom, then we have to confront the fact that the feeling of control is one of the brain's greatest evolutionary achievements, the adaptive delusion. The next question is critical. Why is a system that feels it's in control more adaptive than one that doesn't?
This is where we shift from philosophy into psychology. We move to the concept coined by Ellen Langer, the illusion of control. And this isn't just wishful thinking. It's a measurable psychological bias.
The tendency to overestimate your ability to control events.
Even when they are demonstrably determined entirely by chance. And it's classified as a positive illusion because it genuinely benefits the organism that has it.
Let's ground this with that classic experiment. And the lottery ticket scenario perfectly illustrates how easily we just fabricate a sense of control.
It's a simple but powerful study. You have participants, often office workers, and they're given the chance to buy a lottery ticket. Some of them are allowed to choose their card, while others are just assigned one.
The odds of winning being, of course, exactly the same.
Identical. Then, just before the drawing, they're offered the chance to sell their tickets back. And the results show exactly the value we place on the mere feeling of agency.
The people who chose their own cards valued them way more.
Massively higher. They named a resale price of about $8.67, whereas those who were just assigned a card only wanted about $1.96.
So the mere opportunity for choice, which was totally irrelevant to the outcome, dramatically inflated their perceived control and therefore the ticket's worth.
It speaks to a deep, ingrained cognitive bias. And we know this illusion gets magnified by several factors that our ancestors would have experienced constantly. Familiar situations, having a known desired outcome, feedback that emphasizes success, and critically, a deep emotional need to control the outcome.
So in high-stress, high-uncertainty competitive environments, like, say, high-stakes financial trading, this illusion is at its strongest because the emotional need for control is just paramount.
The brain is essentially confusing activity with control. If I'm engaging more, I must be more in charge. When the situation is familiar, the brain can construct a more fluent narrative of intentionality and choice, and that inflates the sense of authorship, even when there's no actual causality.
And the sources are very clear that this feeling of control is not just some philosophical curiosity. It has profound, measurable, adaptive advantages, physiological ones even.
Oh, absolutely. The perception of control, even when it's objectively absent, functions as this powerful biological buffer against environmental stressors. It's a mechanism for survival and internal regulation.
How does that actually play out in the body?
Well, when you perceive control over a stressor, say you have a button you could press to stop a loud noise, even if you never press it,
Yeah.
you exhibit inhibited autonomic arousal. You reduce stress hormone release like cortisol and less immune system suppression. The perception of control is inherently calming and regulatory.
So just feeling like you have an out, even if you never use it, keeps your body from deteriorating under stress. The opposite of this is learned helplessness, right?
Precisely. Learned helplessness is what happens when an organism learns that its actions have no effect on the environment. That leads to massive stress responses, suppressed immune function, and apathy. The illusion of control is the brain's evolutionary antidote to that.
And it also provides a huge motivational boost, which is obviously key to evolutionary success.
This is maybe its most crucial function. Induced illusory control dramatically enhances persistence in tasks. Just think about an early human hunting or foraging. When the rewards start to diminish or they face some disadvantageous competition, the system that believes its effort matters will keep trying.
Whereas the system that's a hard determinist would just give up because the outcome is already written.
Exactly. The system reinforces the decision-making process itself, the opportunity for choice, and that promotes sustained effort. It's a vital feedback loop for survival.
Okay, so now we need to get to the engine that's generating this feeling. The philosophical debate asks if we have free will. Neuropsychology asks, how does the brain generate the experience of conscious will?
And that brings us to the influential theory from Daniel Wegner. He suggests that conscious will is merely an experience that's fabricated by the brain from interpreting cues of cognitive causality. It's not the actual causal agent.
So it's a retrospective explanation. It's the story the brain tells itself for an action that was already unconsciously initiated by other mechanisms.
Yes, it's the feeling of authorship. It's your brain constructing a narrative that says, I thought X and then Y happened, therefore my thought X must have caused Y. The experience of willing an action arises when three specific factors align in the brain's internal causal analysis system.
And these three factors have to line up perfectly, almost like a forensic checklist.
They do. The first is priority. The thought has to precede the action at a proper short interval, which makes it look like the cause. Second is consistency. The thought, the intention, has to match the action that follows. And third is exclusivity. There can't be any other obvious cause for the action, internal or external.
So if I intend to scratch my nose, and then immediately my hand moves to scratch my nose, and nobody pushed my hand, the brain retrospectively stitches that all together and generates the feeling, I consciously willed that.
Exactly. It's an elegant retrospective inference. Think of the feeling of will as an authorship emotion. It's like a gauge or a compass that alerts the conscious mind to actions that are likely attributable to the self.
So the conscious experience doesn't steer the ship, but it gives you a reading about how the ship is operating beneath you. But why bother with the reading? Why not just operate unconsciously?
Because that feeling is a critical signal. It indicates that an action open to future regulation has just occurred. This experience of authorship is vital for learning, for adapting, and for negotiating social and moral responsibility. If you feel you did it, you're much more likely to learn from the consequences and adjust your behavior next time.
Okay, so the mechanism underlying this authorship emotion is the brain's vast, relentless predictive system. The whole operation is built on the idea that our brain is fundamentally a prediction machine that is just trying to minimize surprise.
This is the core neuroscience. We're relying on a computational model derived from Bayesian statistics, known as the Hierarchical Predictive Belief Update, or HPBU. This model realizes what's called active inference by constantly striving to minimize something called free energy.
Let's slow down on free energy. That's a highly technical term. For the listener, what exactly does it mean in this context?
Think of your brain as a slightly paranoid but incredibly efficient accountant. Free energy, in this context, basically means surprise or prediction error. Your brain is constantly generating hypotheses. It predicts everything you're about to see, hear, or feel. That's the top-down prediction.
And when the actual sensory input, the bottom-up information, contradicts that prediction.
The brain experiences free energy. It's the cognitive cost of being wrong. So if you predict your coffee cup will be light, but you pick it up and it's heavy,
That discrepancy generates free energy.
And the brain has to resolve that surprise.
It has to. And what's fascinating is that free energy isn't just a passive side effect. It's an active component of the belief update scheme. It acts like a switch, controlling how much the new sensory data is integrated with your existing predictions. High surprise means the system needs to listen very closely to the new sensory information to update its model of the world.
And the brain has two fundamental ways to minimize this costly surprise, right?
Yes. It can minimize free energy through perception.
Hmm.
So, updating its internal beliefs about the world to better match the sensory input. Ah, the cup is heavy. I must update my belief about the density of this object.
Or, and this is where agency comes in, it can minimize free energy through action.
Exactly. By changing the world itself to match its existing beliefs. So if your belief is that the cup should be at your lips, but the bottom-up sensory data says it's still on the table, the action of lifting the cup changes the world to match your predicted, desired state, and that minimizes the prediction error.
That's active inference. So action is just a process of making the world conform to the system's best guess about what it should be experiencing. It's why intention feels like causation.
Precisely. And this predictive framework is crucial for generating the sense of agency, or soe, that specific subjective feeling that I am the one generating this action, not the wind or another person. This self-other distinction is vital in dynamic social environments.
How does the system do that? How does it tell the difference?
Well, the sensor-motor system is constantly running these little forensic tests. It relies on the absolute predictability of its own body's movements to identify its own actions. And conversely, it relies on the unpredictability of others' actions to differentiate them from the self.
And this is where the brain uses these internal models to anticipate the consequences of its own commands.
Yeah, the forward model. When your brain issues a motor command, like move arm, it simultaneously sends a carbon copy of that instruction, called an efference copy, to the forward model. This model then immediately predicts the exact sensory consequences of that movement. That predicted feedback is called reafference.
So the brain knows what it expects to feel before the movement even happens.
Exactly. Then a comparator mechanism matches this internal prediction, the reafference, against the actual sensory feedback coming in from the world, the exafference. If they match perfectly, if the world confirms the internal prediction, a strong sense of agency is generated.
And if they match, the brain can effectively cancel out the self-generated sensation, treating it as expected noise. This is the tickling thing, isn't it?
That's the classic illustration. When you try to tickle yourself, the forward model predicted the sensory consequence perfectly. The comparator cancels the sensation, and so it's not ticklish. But if someone else tickles you, the action lacks that internal prediction, so you feel the full, surprising sensory input. And the cerebellum is deeply implicated in forming this powerful, predictive, internal model.
The timing of this agency feeling is still up for debate, though. Does the feeling of agency happen before the action, which we'd call prospective, or is it computed after the fact, which would be retrospective?
Well, the standard comparator model suggests that the sense of agency is computed retrospectively, only after the outcome feedback has reached the comparator. This strongly supports Wegner's illusionist view that the brain generates the sense of agency as a conclusion it draws after the action is already complete.
But our healthy experience of agency feels like it's happening before or during the action. It feels like we are consciously steering in real time.
And that's because healthy agency involves strong prospective elements, predictions about probable outcomes. Studies show that something called action selection fluency, which is basically the certainty you have about which action to make, significantly boosts the feeling of control.
So just feeling decisive about an action is part of the mechanism that makes us feel like we chose it freely, even though that feeling of decisiveness might just be another determined biological state.
Correct. The brain uses these internal rules of thumb because they are usually adaptive. And we really see the profound failure of this system in certain clinical examples, which helps illuminate its true mechanics.
Right. The example of schizophrenia is particularly telling when it comes to this perspective element.
In patients with schizophrenia, that perspective element of agency is often just abolished. They struggle with predicting the sensory consequences of their own actions. Therefore, their sense of agency is based largely only on retrospective reconstructions driven by what actually happens.
They often misattribute their own actions to external forces.
Yes. They're essentially in a constant state of surprise regarding their own self-generated events. Their predictive mechanism fails to damp down the sensory input, and that leads to this profound confusion between self and other. The failure of prediction leads to a failure of agency, confirming that agency is built on prediction, not on some independent causation.
Okay, so we've established that the feeling of will is an adaptive signal generated by a predictive machine following a determined causal chain. Now we have to shift to the deepest evolutionary question. Why did consciousness and this powerful feeling of control emerge in the first place? When we talk about evolution, it's so vital to remember that these systems are rarely optimal.
That's a critical point. Biological systems are, in the language of the sources, jerry-rigged. They're cobbled together good enough solutions built from whatever materials were available. They're not the product of some intelligent, optimal design.
And one of the main constraints is just the time lag, right? We have a Stone Age brain trying to deal with the complexities of modern civilization.
And we also face the constraint of local optima. Selection can only favor a trait that is slightly superior to its immediate predecessor. It can't jump across a metaphorical deep fitness valley to find a truly optimal solution that might be far away on the evolutionary landscape. Selection only works with what's immediately available. It has no foresight.
And this framework forces us to be careful about defining consciousness as a pure adaptation, a feature that evolved specifically for its current function. It might be something else entirely.
It might be an exaptation. That's a feature that's useful to an organism now, but it didn't arise for its present role. It was co-opted for a new function later. The classic example is feathers. They probably evolved for thermoregulation first and were only later co-opted for flight.
Or even more passively, it could just be a spandrel.
A spandrel is just a functionless byproduct of other adaptive processes. The redness of our blood, for example, is a byproduct of the adaptive process of oxygen transport via hemoglobin. The color red has no function in and of itself. So we have to use this pluralistic perspective adaptation, exaptation spandrel when trying to get our heads around something as vast as consciousness and the sense of agency.
Regardless of how we categorize it, consciousness must have conferred some kind of powerful, major selective advantage. What do the sources suggest was the initial driving function for its emergence?
Well, the hypothesis is that consciousness may have first evolved as a sophisticated device for incorporating learning in a really novel and flexible way. It allowed organisms to make better choices between alternative complex actions than was possible using simpler non-conscious pathways like reflexes or basic conditioning.
And this capability is linked to the concept of unlimited associative learning, or UAL.
Right. UAL is proposed as an evolutionary transition marker, an ETM, for minimal consciousness. This advanced learning capacity, which some sources hypothesize may have first evolved around the Cambrian explosion in arthropods, is what enabled truly complex cognitive functions.
What are the signatures of this more complex learning? What can it do?
Well, crucially, UAL enables multimodal discrimination learning, so integrating information across different senses. It enables the capacity for integration over time, which is basically working memory or temporal depth. But most importantly, it enables flexible evaluation systems.
Meaning things like reverse learning, being able to quickly unlearn an association.
Yes, and also goal revaluation, deciding a reward is no longer worth the effort. This ability to flexibly evaluate your goals provides a massive adaptive edge.
So minimal consciousness is the functional architecture you need to support this flexible, advanced, time-integrated learning. And the feeling of agency must be intrinsic to that system.
It's conjectured that the feeling of agency, the ability to explore, to exercise curiosity, to engage in goal-directed behavior, is inherently joyful to the system. And that alongside suffering, this joy was likely one of the first basic feelings of a sentient animal. This intrinsic valuation system reinforces the successful goal-directed actions that UAL enables. It makes the system want to repeat the actions it perceives as its own.
So the feeling of agency and control is a deep biological reality because it ties directly into this evolved drive to achieve goals. We need a rigorous way to define that drive.
We can define goal-directed behavior in a very abstract way. It's not just physical movement in space like a cheetah chasing prey. It can also be internal movement in a system's state space, like regulating your metabolic rate, your temperature, or your neural activity levels.
And all goal-directed entities, whether they are simple thermostats or complex organisms, share two universal signature features.
These are persistence and plasticity. Persistence is the inherent bias toward the target state. The system always works toward the goal, even if it's inefficient or facing massive obstacles.
And plasticity.
Plasticity is the efficiency or directness with which the system moves toward that target state. A plastic system finds the best route to the goal. And we can use these metrics to assess the efficacy of any goal-directed system, even the movement of thought,
on a trajectory across mental states.
And the feeling of control or agency is the internal feedback mechanism that evolution uses to reinforce the behavioral trajectories that exhibit high persistence and lead to desired states. It ensures that regardless of the underlying determinism, the machine keeps running and efficiently seeking its goals.
Precisely.
Okay, so if we accept the scientific and evolutionary consensus that conscious will is an adaptive illusion, a sophisticated necessary system that keeps us persistent and responsible, we now have to grapple with the massive social and moral consequences. What happens when we publicly embrace hard determinism?
The consequences are, well, they're destabilizing. Because the illusion of free will is the engine of so many of our social justification systems.
The primary moral downside of a strong societal belief in free will is that it justifies deserved inequalities. This is where the debate gets really uncomfortable because it moves from the lab to our neighbors.
If people truly believe they possess absolute free choice, the logical corollary is that those who succeed deserve their wealth and status, and those who fail, those in poverty, deserve their misfortune because they didn't choose otherwise or exercise sufficient willpower.
And we have specific and pretty disturbing data on this linkage.
Yes. Research conducted in the UK, for instance, showed that a strong belief in free will leads people to attribute poverty overwhelmingly to personal choice rather than to social misfortune or biological handicap or structural barriers. As many as 83% of Britons surveyed thought that virtually everyone remains in poverty due to their own volition.
That belief acts as a powerful barrier against reform. It fuels a steep fall in support for wealth redistribution. It limits sympathy only to those who clearly did not choose their disadvantage, like someone who suffers a natural disaster.
And it creates a fascinating ethical dilemma. If two people work the same job, and one saves rigorously while the other spends freely, society praises the first person's willpower. But if that willpower is merely the predetermined outcome of a low-stress, nurturing childhood that developed a robust PFC, how do we justify rewarding that outcome and blaming the person whose early, stressful environment compromised their impulse control?
The belief in free will allows us to ignore the causal background entirely.
It does. And accepting hard determinism has radical implications for every institution, but especially the criminal justice system. If no one can truly choose their character, then blame and retributive punishment become, as Sapolsky puts it, scientifically unjustifiable.
So hard determinists like him argue for abolishing retributive punishment, moving instead toward models focused purely on societal safety, prevention, and rehabilitation. We would stop asking, did they deserve this? And start asking, how do we manage this determined outcome for the safety of all?
Yes. Philosophers like Derek Pereboom suggest adapting the medical quarantine model. We detain individuals who pose a danger, not as punishment for a moral failing, but as a necessary safety measure, much like quarantining someone with a contagious illness or safely storing a malfunctioning machine.
But there's a massive emotional obstacle to this shift away from retribution, isn't there? We are biologically wired to enjoy retribution.
That's the profound challenge. Retributive punishment, the act of condemning, blaming, or exacting revenge, activates the dopamine reward pathway in the brain. It quite literally feels good when people we deem deserving are punished. We are biologically rewarded for upholding a morally and scientifically unjustifiable system.
That biological reward system must make the shift to purely preventative justice incredibly difficult. It requires us to actively fight our deepest, most satisfying moral instincts.
It does. The difficulty lies in looking at someone who has caused profound societal pain and recognizing that the brain that led them to that moment is the end product of a seamless, uncontrollable chain of influences. It requires us to abandon the emotional gratification of blame for the intellectual rigor of management and prevention.
So why then, if it's scientifically false and socially damaging by justifying inequality, do so many smart people cling to this idea of positive illusionism that we should just keep the lie going?
Because the illusion of conscious will is considered socially necessary. It's profoundly functional. It works to create responsibility by making us feel like authors of our actions. This sense of personal authorship is the essential basis for negotiating social and legal responsibility within a group.
It's the foundation for the social contract. If I don't feel I chose to honor my word, I won't feel obligated to uphold it.
Exactly. And the belief in free will powerfully fosters cooperation by enabling self-punishment. Things like guilt and shame. They are forms of self-punishment that internalize social norms.
Guilt signals to ourselves that we violated a norm, and shame signals to others that we acknowledge the violation.
Yes. Blushing when ashamed, for example, is a biological signal to the group that the individual knows the norm and is already punishing themselves internally. This often evokes empathy and prevents further social exclusion. The illusion creates cooperative, responsible group members via this self-regulation mechanism.
Right.
We need that feeling of agency to hold ourselves accountable to the group.
The great fear is that if we abandon the concept of free choice, society will just collapse into amorality. The sources, however, they offer a powerful historical perspective that really challenges this fear.
Society has a strong history of willingly retracting moral judgment as our scientific knowledge increases. We're constantly finding new biological mechanisms for what were previously seen as moral failures.
Can you walk through some of those key historical examples?
Sapolsky points out instances where we realized that epileptic seizures are not cavorting with Satan, but are caused by disorganized neural activity, or that schizophrenia is not caused by a mother's toxic hatred of her child, but is a disease of brain development, or that dyslexia isn't laziness, but a cortical malformation that impairs phonological processing.
In each case, our increased understanding of the underlying biology, the determined causes, led us to stop blaming the individual and instead manage the condition through medicine or therapy or social accommodation.
And in each instance, civilization did not collapse. The world, in fact, became a more humane place. This precedent strongly suggests that subtracting the belief that actions are freely chosen doesn't lead to a moral desert, but rather to a more compassionate society focused on prevention and management instead of blame and retribution.
The profound challenge remains how to reconcile the scientific truth of hard determinism, that we are biological machines, with the adaptive necessity of feeling like a responsible agent.
And the key might lie in the fact that we are the only biological machines that know our machineness. The brain is this elegant accounting system that constructs the person and the authorship emotion to facilitate effective social relations. Far from undermining responsibility, the illusion of conscious will is what creates the very first-person sense of responsibility that is the basis for the social and legal responsibility we all negotiate.
This has been a monumental deep dive into the very nature of human action. We've discovered that our conscious will is likely an expertly crafted, retrospective interpretation, an authorship emotion generated by these hierarchical predictive mechanisms designed to minimize surprise. Yet, this delusion is profoundly adaptive.
That feeling of control, that sense of agency, it provides tangible, measurable benefits. Physiological resilience to stress, enhanced persistence toward our goals, and the necessary foundation for defining responsibility and enabling complex human cooperation through self-regulation like guilt and shame. We are systems evolved for persistence and plasticity, and the feeling of will ensures we persist.
We may be biological machines following a seamless causal chain, but the evolution of unlimited associative learning and the accompanying feelings of agency and goal-directed joy transformed us into the only machines that know our own machineness. And it is that subjective internal knowledge that turns our feelings and intentions into powerful motivating forces to us. The brain creates its own reality that reinforces goal-directed behavior.
And as we continue to map the deterministic causes of behavior, we face that recurring historical pattern. Jettisoning the idea of moral blame when we identify the underlying mechanism, whether it's neurochemistry or developmental constraint, has always led society to become more humane.
Which raises one final provocative thought for you to consider. If the feeling of will is an adaptive signal indicating an action is open to future regulation, what new areas of human behavior are currently judged as profound moral failings, things like chronic underachievement, pathological impulse control, or addiction, might we eventually evolve to view purely as biological outcomes?
Outcomes to be managed through sophisticated incentive structures, social support, and medical intervention, rather than punished through blame and retribution.
The ultimate question for you is, what is the next societal attribution we will willingly subtract from the realm of choice to create a more humane future?